vivacity and vibrance of a region of the world that's really known for it. Talk to us through this map that is Rio.
Yeah, so Rio, another map we wanted to do for a long time. We have several artists on the team that spent a part of their life there, so it's pretty fun to kind of dive in and see this Overwatch version of Rio, the beautifully painted favelas, colorful, vibrant club. You get to visit where Lucio's club is. The team loves going to Brazilian barbecue, so one of the spawn rooms is a Brazilian barbecue place. You know, it's another map. We're just having a lot of fun creating different details and this aspirational version of this location for Overwatch 2. And it's a brand new payload here too. You guys saw earlier, it's a pretty fun carnival float. So we're just having fun with these maps. The cool Brazilian barbecue. It's fun and sunny and colorful. And I think it's a map that feels like Overwatch when you play it, you know?
I mean, already that sort of signature vibrance that, you know, so many of, Overwatch's maps have been credited for is there. Can you, obviously, I don't want you to give away too much of the story, but is there a context here? Like, where are the attackers starting from? Because I see some beach, I see different landscapes sort of getting fleshed out here as we go through the map.
Okay, so the defense actually starts in Lucio's home. So, yeah, obviously, there's a story layer to Overwatch that we want to tell, so Lucio plays a big part of that. So, you get a little hint of where we're going with that, but we're not talking too heavily about it. Also, Lucio's club is it's kind of a community place, so it's a place, if it was real, people can come there for free. He's a community guy. We wanted to showcase this with this gigantic kind of sci-fi club he has. Yeah, it's connected to the story of Overwatch. We'll just have to wait and see how closely Rio plays into the game. You saw a little bit at BlizzCon a while ago, but there's definitely more.
Right, so
I do have a question for Jeff. Sorry to cut you off, Mitch, but I do have a question if that's fine. So if I'm pretty sure, like way back in the day, there was like an interview that I read that was like 5 was too small and 7 was too big for the roster limit, and then 6 was perfect. But like, I'm kind of curious, like where along like the Overwatch timeline did that philosophy kind of change? Like, was it role lock? Was it like people learning how to play the game better? Like, you know what I mean?
Pretty much all of this. Yeah, I mean, we know so much about the game. I mean, as kind of Aaron touched on at the beginning, like before everything, I mean, you could just play 5 Winstons. In fact, we had an internal tournament where that was the strategy. 5 Winstons and a Zenyatta. It was sort of like, oh my god, this seems like maybe a problem, or is this cool? We don't know. So, like, obviously, when you're building really any game, you try to make the best judgments for what you have and what you're playing, but once you have the game in the wild, you get it in everybody else's hands, and it marinates for a while, and you're making changes, like, your opinion on this stuff definitely changes. So, I think over time, like it was touched on, we were still keeping an open mind to maybe doing some of these kind of changes, and then coming Overwatch 2, we were just like, let's revisit everything, and that was definitely one of the major core decisions of Overwatch 1 we were really looking forward to revisiting, and at that point we were just like, yeah, maybe this is actually just much better, maybe we were wrong all along, although the people always say, it's kind of a design thing, people say, you're not necessarily wrong at the time just because you were wrong in retrospect. Who knows? Yeah. But, yeah.
So obviously this is a hybrid map. I don't know if I mentioned that at the beginning here. So much in the same way as Kings Row, we'll be fighting for control of a payload here, which will eventually roll on out. And we kind of teased, these payloads. This is, I mean, I'm no stranger to peacocking. Look at what I'm wearing. But this is great. Obviously, we tell a story in Overwatch in Overwatch 1 with these payloads here. So looking forward to seeing how that story gets fleshed out. What I'm seeing already is real difference in map geometry, right? As we move into the second phase, all of a sudden it's less about chokes and overpasses, and it's just this jumble of all these buildings and so much high ground here. Really feel like the way you play the map changes drastically here.
Yeah, that was.
Oh, you can go ahead.
Oh, that was just one thing. We're trying more of this phased approach with the visuals and the gameplay as we move through the space. So you saw it was a bit more open. As you get the payload, there's a feeling of changing gameplay and art as well. So this visual progression as well as gameplay is much more clear in some of the newer maps we're working on.
Yeah, one thing that maybe it's just me maybe it's just a coincidence, but I feel like a lot of chokes in Overwatch 1, like specifically like I think like Hanamura first or like going through King's Row second, they're very like tight and like it's like perfect for like a Reinhardt shield to spread across, and it can be like, you know, a real pain to get through those sometimes because you feel like you really only have like one way to go through. But I'm seeing, at least in the other 2 maps that we looked at, a lot more flanks and ways to access the point, and I think that's overall better for the design because I feel like when you, especially on Hanamura first, like going through that choke is kind of, you know, it can be real not fun sometimes if you're just not clicking, or if it's just, you know, they have a hard comp that you just can't counter, and I think it's just better overall.
Yeah, if we want to give players more options to solve a problem, say they're stuck at the choke, they have a few more options to break through. Basically, they don't have to rely fully on the tank powering through this time. But yeah, that's always the thing. We're trying to improve the options the players have to solve situations.
Are there going to be previous maps in Overwatch 1 that will be reworked, or
we don't know
can
yet.
you not say? Is that secret?
No.
Or
I don't know.
okay, fair enough.
So obviously, you've got one less hero on the battlefield. Your maps are much more labyrinthine, I guess, or just bigger, right? It's just a large, you know, there's so much more ground you could cover if you wanted to take a different approach. How do you sort of balance how big the map is, right? Because obviously there's a sense where, like, you know, if you go too far in one direction, right, it can seem quite barren. Here, like, everything, there's attention to detail everywhere, right? There's so many crisscrossing ways of approaching the point. So it doesn't feel big, but it definitely, as opposed to maps we saw in Overwatch on live right now, it definitely feels bigger, right? Was that ever a consideration, trying to balance that, the sort of size and the majesty of it all?
Yeah, it's definitely more detailed than before, and again, the more options, there's more passageways and buildings for players to move through and build strategies from. But ultimately, the maps are in a fairly similar size to the previous. You're just seeing a lot more detail out of the Overwatch 2 engine. We have a lot of cool upgrades that allow us to do more while keeping a smooth performance. But yeah, it's something we're constantly playing with, the scale of maps and how it feels to move through the space, visually as well as gameplay wise.
This really has like a Dorado feel almost, right? We have sort of payloads that are moving through underneath, and there are multiple levels here. This is not just sort of 2 levels here. There's even more options, I guess, to sort of make use of this verticality.
Yeah, there's like a left high ground, right high ground. There's so much going on here.
Yeah. I love this point in particular. Like, taking that middle high ground is, you know, really important. If you can hold it, it's fantastic, but it's just really hard to hold because you have all these upper flank routes and under flank routes and stuff. So it ends up being like kind of a gambit to try to even take it and hold it, especially when you don't have tanks that can just sit on it with barriers all the time. But it's so powerful. You can see where Widow is right there. It's so powerful. You have this line of sight on everything up there.
So is Universal ult charge nerfed, or is it just as a result of the tank changes that it seems like people are getting their ult slower?
It's mostly just the tanks, and we don't have. They're probably, I can't remember exactly all the individual changes, but I think we probably adjusted a few heroes here and there. May have gone up or down on their costs, but it's almost entirely just the tank changes. You generate a lot of ult off tanks in our game.
Right, I guess there's one less tank to shoot as well, so it makes it a little bit harder.
Although looking at Widow is an interesting example. We haven't adjusted the snipers too much yet, but we're keeping a really close eye on them because a lot of what sort of controls snipers is the fact there's all these barriers you can't shoot through. When you're playing as Widow against a comp that is, you know, like back in the day when it was like Wrecking Ball only or something like that, like you definitely are a lot more powerful. So we have to make sure that they don't get out of control.
I feel like on some of these choke points, it's definitely a lot more wider than some other maps, and I feel like you know, if unchecked, some certain Widows could do a lot of damage. Yeah. So yeah, it's just yet another thing we got to keep an eye on with change like this.
Right.
I mean, you know, we talk about how sort of tanks have changed now to sort of allow them to be more multi-purpose or sort of fill a broader spectrum of roles. Obviously, like, you know, when you have a Reinhardt, you kind of know what the player is playing for, right? The shield creates space, right? You create space just because the shield exists. And with someone like Roadhog, they create space because of the threat of the hook, right? It's not even something that's necessarily, it's implied threat, right? It's not
exactly
directly displayed. So I mean, what is the idea for a tank? Do you still want there to be the mix of there sort of being that implied threat plus obviously a very visible threat? Has it changed the way you think about how tanks create spaces now? Obviously, all tanks have to be able to do that to some degree, regardless if they have a shield or not.
Yeah, absolutely, and obviously also impacts new hero design. Working on new heroes, how they're going to interact with creating space and defending their team. Certainly, looking at Arisa's not being played here for a reason because we're looking at her really heavily. Any hero that has sort of just the really kind of heavy static slow defense are the ones we're kind of trying to hit the hardest first. And then just that alone already makes Roadhog shine a little bit because he's not being compared to the huge barrier Reinhardt. But certainly, should have healed there first probably, but he went for it. Yeah, so like there's a lot of changes we can make now in this world that would have been really scary to make before, especially in regards to cooldowns. So like Roadhog used to have a much faster hook way back in the day. Maybe we can bring that back, especially in a world where all the tanks are pretty aggressive, so it doesn't feel like it's super crazy. We still want to make sure there's enough like counterplay. You don't want to feel like we made him dodge the hook and then we had no opportunity to attack because he just hooked again right afterwards. So it's certainly a balancing act, but a lot of the tank sort of tankiness can be just in the hero themselves now, because if you get to go in and be threatening, like with all this extra damage, and just be hard to kill, you're just creating space by existing.
What an animal.
Obviously, Super, I'm curious to get your opinion here. Obviously, as someone who plays tank, right, and you'll play main tank as we called it, or off tank. What is it that makes you sort of feel most powerful when you're playing tank? Right, because obviously all the heroes offer something so different, each of them both. Can you narrow it down to something? What makes you feel like MTD feel,
Yeah, I feel like a lot of it comes down to like decision making, right? And a lot of that currently is kind of based off of the fact of what your second tank is doing, which is obviously no longer a thing because there's a removal. And I feel like this is really gonna have to rely a lot more on like your supports keeping you a lot more alive as opposed to like your off tank or secondary tank, being in coordination with you. Because the supports now, they only have to focus on one tank in particular. As opposed to, having to split it between two. And I feel like that's probably gonna have to give a lot more, tanks are gonna have to play a lot more, I guess, assertive, because they can't really rely on their other tank to make the decisions for them, or like to help them out in that way.
I feel like it definitely changed. I know, there's a good handful of players who, their selection of tank really boils down to their capacity to deal damage. Like a lot of times, like you'll see them, right? You get these weird sort of Sigma Zarya comps, or you see like a lot of people just like playing Roadhog. That's their favorite tank because he does damage. Trying to make a player feel powerful on tank without just doing damage requires you to really think much more about game design. That's what I kind of wondered. Like, outside of just doing a ton of damage, how do you sort of balance a tank to make them feel powerful without just pumping numbers into their primary fight?
Yeah, I feel like that's probably a design philosophy that I'm maybe not qualified to talk about.
That's convenient because I wasn't actually asking you, but you can weigh in on it first.
Okay, yeah, I'll stop speaking. That's good. No, that's good. I'll stop speaking.
I'm curious what your opinion is, but yeah, I mean, a lot of it's like we're talking about with just options, and like Super mentioned, like we just want to make sure that, I mean, that's kind of the point of the Zarya change, is just giving her more flexibility and more options. So, I mean, it happens to be she also generates a crap load more energy and is way scarier, does more damage in this case. We may have to rein that in a little bit. She was already running out on that last little bit there with like 80% and then 100%, so you can see it's pretty aggressive. But yeah, it's definitely just trying to create really interesting playmaking opportunities and just strategic thought, and I think that's where a lot of people kind of like to have the tanks exist, where it's, if you really want to just click heads, there are probably better options out there. I don't think we're likely to make any kind of like sniper tank out there or anything like that, because there's a lot of other opportunities for that. We'd like to try to keep the tanks like I was mentioning with the crowd control changes as an example of this. We'd like to keep the tanks being the ones who are primarily able to do crowd control, and that's also with only being one tank now. It means still there's going to be a lot less crowd control in the game in general, but still allow them to sort of flex that particular element.
Right, so you talk about obviously taking a little bit of that away from Mei, but obviously it's still something that, you know, you feel like you could include in the game. It almost feels like it's a more moderated approach to it now, because tanks can be the ones that bear a lot of that sort of crowd control potential. It just means that there's, you know, now it's just that one hero on the battlefield that really is able to produce so much of that outside of, you know, 5 different forms that are coming in. So it feels like almost the responsibility as a tank player is almost kicked up a notch there, because you got to be a jack of all trades in some cases.
Especially if crowd control gets reduced to a point where you're looking for to counter something specific, like you're looking for Genji Blade that then you know is ready, and you need to, let's say you're playing Hog, you like really want to land that hook when he comes in. It's a really big game changer if you land it. So sort of like make sure it's up and then you save it and try to keep an eye on him. And conversely, if you're a character who is really watching for, you know, like Reaper or something like that, wants to get his ult off, but you want to make sure you're not going to get stunned, it's a lot easier to sort of track who's can stop you. You know, you're looking for their tank and looking for, rather than looking at the whole enemy team. It's kind of like when you're Zarya trying to ult and you're watching T.Va really close because you don't want to have it eaten, and that's what you're most concerned with as far as timing goes. It's like that with more CC in general, I think.
This guy's nuts on Roadhog.
Yeah.
even with sort of less knockback, Ryan obviously being as close as he was to the whole hog just gets knocked away. I sort of remember it was almost like a tooltip text loading into game, sort of playing Overwatch, that sort of said like, listen out for footsteps, like the heavier footsteps mean your opponent is potentially more dangerous to you. But it definitely feels like, you know, the weight of these weapons is much more effectively conveyed, right? If I'm listening here as we're sort of talking. Like that scrap gun sounds extremely meaty.
I love the weapon sounds. He's done such a great job.
And they,
especially like
Widow.
Soldier. Oh, Widow, yeah, Widow's so great.
Widow is
the sort of
insane.
like the echoing sound when you shoot in an open space. Oh my god, it's fantastic.
You really feel like you're actually wielding a very high caliber weapon, right? That actually has weight and it has a sense of kickback and sort of makes sound. And also like it, based on where you are in the map, you know, the environment, you know, I think this is maybe covered, I think, this one online as well, but it really feels like the environment, we were inside, you know, club, in Lucio's club beforehand, and that echo is really much more apparent, right? That the environment playing a big role in how things sound.
And being on the receiving end of Widowmaker's shot, it just feels so much more dangerous hearing the sound. So it helps you hide, basically.